In early 1942, Japanese naval aviators ruled the skies of the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, from the Philippines to the Indian Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter pilots flew with absolute confidence, and for good reason. Their primary weapon was the Mitsubishi SM-0, lightweight, extremely maneuverable, long-ranged. Against it, early American carrier fighters bled heavily. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, U.S. Navy and Marine pilots lost aircraft at a ratio approaching 5-to-1 in some engagements. The Zero could outclimb them, outrun them, outlast them. Japanese pilots quickly learned they could dictate the fight and survive it. Captured combat reports from 1942 reveal a recurring phrase used by Japanese aviators when describing American fighters: large, heavy, clumsy. The Americans were predictable. They turned when challenged. They tried to dogfight and died. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy understood a brutal truth. If the air war continued on its current path, American carrier aviation would be slowly bled to death. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had already produced the F-4F, Wildcat, rugged, reliable, but clearly inferior to the Zero in pure performance. It was a stopgap. Everyone knew it. What the Navy needed now wasn't a refinement. It needed a killer. In June 1942, just days after the Battle of Midway, Grumman engineers received direct combat feedback from surviving pilots. The message was blunt. Do not try to outturn the Zero. Do not try to outclimb it. Do not chase elegance. Build something that absorbs punishment, dives faster, hits harder, and comes home. One Japanese intelligence officer would later write, "The Americans do not understand aerial beauty. They build aircraft like trucks." That insult would soon become prophecy. By late 1942, rumors began circulating among Japanese pilots operating over Guadalcanal. The Americans were introducing a new carrier fighter. Bigger than the Wildcat, heavier, powered by a massive radial engine. Early encounters led to laughter. Japanese pilots nicknamed it informally as the Fat Wildcat. They assumed it would turn worse, climb slower, and burn just as easily. On paper, the assumptions seemed correct. The new aircraft, designated F-6F Hellcat, weighed nearly 2,000 pounds more than the Zero. It carried thick armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, a reinforced airframe built to survive carrier landings. To Japanese doctrine, this was wasted weight. Speed and agility won fights, not armor. What they didn't understand was that the Hellcat was never designed to fight the Zero on Japanese terms. It was designed to end the war in the air. Under the cowling sat the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, producing over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of early Zero variants. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns delivered a combined 7,200 rounds per minute. Its wings could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart. And most importantly, it was designed around pilot survival. By early 1943, Hellcats began arriving aboard American carriers across the Pacific. Young pilots fresh from stateside training climbed into cockpits, surrounded by armor glass and steel, knowing something had changed. The Japanese laughed. They would stop laughing very soon, because over the next 2 years, the F-6F Hellcat would achieve something no fighter in history ever had. It would destroy more enemy aircraft than any other naval fighter ever built. It would finish the Pacific War with a confirmed kill ratio of 19-1, and it would permanently erase Japanese air superiority from the sky. But that transformation did not happen overnight. First, the Hellcat had to prove itself in combat. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. To understand why the Hellcat would later devastate Japanese air power, You first have to understand why the Zero was so dominant in the early Pacific War. In 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was not just a fighter. It was the physical expression of Japanese naval doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed air combat would be decided by elite pilots. Flying lightweight aircraft, winning through skill and maneuver, range mattered. Agility mattered, survivability did not. The Zero reflected this philosophy perfectly. It had no armor plate behind the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. Every kilogram saved was converted into range and maneuverability. As a result, the Zero could fly farther than any carrier fighter in the world. It could outturn nearly anything it faced. And in the hands of veteran pilots trained 4 years before the war, it was lethal. Japanese naval aviators in 1941 were arguably the best in the world. Their training pipeline was brutal. Only a fraction of candidates survived it. Those who did emerged with hundreds of flight hours, far more than their American counterparts at the time. So when war began, the Zero didn't just meet inferior aircraft. It met inexperienced pilots flying machines designed under completely different assumptions. American fighters like the F-2A Buffalo and early Wildcats were built with survivability in mind. Heavier, sturdier, slower to turn. Against the Zero, they seemed hopelessly outclassed. Over China, over Southeast Asia, and across the Pacific, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese pilots initiated combat at will. They climbed above their opponents. They forced turning fights. They disengaged when they chose. U.S. Navy combat reports from 1942 describe pilots firing entire ammunition loads without effect, while a few 20mm shells from a Zero could tear an aircraft apart. But the Zero's dominance hid a fatal weakness. It relied on never being hit. Even a single .50 caliber round could ignite its fuel tanks. A short burst could shear off control surfaces. A near miss could cripple it. Japanese doctrine assumed such hits would never happen, because superior pilots would avoid them. That assumption would not survive a prolonged industrial war. As losses mounted in 1942, Japan faced a problem it had never planned for. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours, less experience, and far less tactical flexibility. Yet they flew the same fragile aircraft, using the same aggressive tactics, against an enemy that was learning rapidly. Meanwhile, the United States adapted. Instead of trying to turn with the Zero, American pilots developed tactics like the thatch weave, diving attacks, and mutual support formations. They accepted that they could not outturn the Zero, but they could outthink it. Still, tactics alone were not enough. The Zero remained dangerous. Its climb rate and agility still punished mistakes brutally. By late 1942, U.S. commanders reached a clear conclusion. No matter how good the tactics became, American pilots needed an aircraft that matched doctrine with reality. An aircraft that could take hits. An aircraft that could dive away at will. An aircraft that turned pilot mistakes into survivable lessons, not death sentences. The Zero ruled the Pacific because it was invincible. It ruled because it arrived first, flown by elite men, against an enemy that was unprepared. That window was closing. And waiting just beyond it was an aircraft designed not for beauty, but for attrition. The F-6F Hellcat did not begin as a bold vision of the future. It began as a confession of failure. By early 1942, Grumman engineers knew the truth long before it was spoken publicly. The Wildcat, no matter how rugged, was reaching the limits of what it could do. Against the Zero, it survived, but it did not dominate. So Grumman did something unusual. Instead of designing an aircraft in isolation, they built it around combat reports. Pilots fresh from battles over Wake Island, the Coral Sea, and Midway sat down with engineers. They didn't talk about elegance or innovation. They talked about fear. They talked about tracers passing through wings, about fuel tanks igniting, about watching friends disappear in a single turning mistake. The message was consistent. We don't need to turn tighter. We need to come home. The Hellcat was designed backward from that sentence. The first design requirement was pilot survival. Armor plate behind the seat. Bullet-resistant windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks thick enough to absorb multiple hits. Next came power. The Navy insisted on the Pratt and Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful radial engines ever produced. At over 2,000 horsepower, it gave the Hellcat brutal acceleration and unmatched dive performance. The result was an aircraft that looked excessive, wide fuselage, thick wings, landing gear strong enough to survive violent carrier landings. It weighed more than anything it replaced. Japanese engineers would have called it inefficient. Grumman called it necessary. Armament followed the same philosophy. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings, fed by deep ammunition reserves. The Hellcat was not built for precise marksmanship. It was built to flood the sky with lead. Short-firing windows became lethal. Deflection shots became forgiving. Then came the feature pilots would love most. The Hellcat could dive. Where the zero-risk structural failure at high speeds, the Hellcat could plunge steeply, pulling away from combat at will. It allowed American pilots to choose when to fight, and when not to. In early prototype testing, Grumman pushed the aircraft hard. They bent airframes, they overstressed wings, they crashed planes, and then they reinforced them. By mid-1942, the Navy had its answer: not a dogfighter, a predator. One test pilot described the Hellcat simply: it doesn't ask you to be perfect. That sentence alone summarized the design philosophy. The Hellcat was not built for aces. It was built for average pilots, flying in large numbers, across a vast ocean, in a war of exhaustion. By the time the first production models rolled off the line, the United States had already committed to total industrial war. Factories could replace aircraft faster than Japan could replace pilots. The Hellcat was designed to exploit that imbalance mercilessly. It would not win through grace. It would win by surviving long enough to kill. The Hellcat did not enter the war quietly. In August 1943, as American carriers moved across the Central Pacific, the F-6F finally met the enemy it had been built to destroy. Japanese pilots had heard rumors. A new American fighter, fast in a dive, heavily armed. Most dismissed it. They had heard such claims before. The first major encounters took place during strikes against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Hellcat squadrons launched from carriers at dawn, engines roaring, climbing into skies still believed to belong to the Zero. The initial engagements were cautious. American pilots did not turn. They did not chase. They climbed. They dove. They fired short, brutal bursts, and broke away. And something unexpected happened. They survived. In early dogfights, Hellcat pilots reported taking hits that would have destroyed earlier fighters. Fuel tanks sealed, engines kept running, aircraft limped back to carriers, riddled with holes, but intact. For the first time, American pilots were learning in combat without paying for mistakes with their lives. Japanese pilots noticed immediately. Zeros that attempted high-speed dives found themselves unable to follow. Those that pressed attacks discovered that a single hit from a Hellcat's .50 caliber guns could disintegrate wings or ignite fuel tanks instantly. Kill claims rose quickly. In its first months of combat, the Hellcat began achieving kill ratios that stunned U.S. intelligence officers reviewing after-action reports. It wasn't luck, it was design. The Hellcat allowed American pilots to fight vertically, using altitude, speed, and firepower instead of turning contests. It punished impatience. Japanese veterans could still be dangerous. But now, the margin for error had disappeared. One U.S. Navy pilot described his first victory simply, "I fired. The Zero caught fire. I was already gone." That single sentence reflected a new reality. Combat no longer revolved around prolonged duels. It became transactional. Hit, break away, climb, repeat. Japanese losses mounted. Even worse for Japan. Hellcat pilots were improving rapidly. Each sortie added experience. Each return to the carrier meant lessons learned. The Zero offered no such forgiveness. As 1943 progressed, Japanese commanders began noticing a change in pilot behavior. Their aviators were becoming cautious. Some refused turning fights entirely. Others broke off attacks prematurely. Fear, once unthinkable among elite naval aviators, was creeping in. By late 1943, the Hellcat had already altered the balance of power in the Pacific sky, but its true test had not yet come. Because ahead lay a battle so massive, so decisive, that it would expose the full consequences of Japan's failure to adapt. A battle where hundreds of aircraft would clash in a matter of hours. A battle history would later remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By June 1944, the air war in the Pacific had reached its breaking point. The United States was preparing to seize the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From there, American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. For Japan, this was existential. If the Marianas fell, the war would become unwinnable. So the Imperial Japanese Navy committed nearly everything it had left. Carrier divisions were assembled. Land-based aircraft were rushed into position. Veteran pilots were pulled from training units to lead formations of inexperienced men. The plan was simple: destroy the American carrier fleet in one decisive battle. What Japan did not fully understand was how much the balance had already shifted. On June 19, 1944, Japanese aircraft began launching in waves toward the U.S. fleet. Hundreds of planes lifted off, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, many flown by pilots with fewer than 100 flight hours. Waiting for them was something the Japanese had never faced before: a layered system of detection, control, and destruction. American radar picked up the incoming strikes at long range. Fighter direction officers calmly vectored Hellcat squadrons into position. The sky over the Philippine Sea became a killing ground. Hellcats attacked from above, diving through Japanese formations before breaking away at speed. Zeros tried to respond, but they were slower, more fragile, and flown by men who had never experienced combat on this scale. The results were catastrophic. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft was annihilated before reaching the U.S. fleet. Pilots reported Zeros bursting into flames after single firing passes. Bombers flew on, unguided and unescorted, only to be cut apart by anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the first day, Japanese losses were staggering. Over 300 aircraft destroyed. American losses were minimal by comparison. The slaughter earned an infamous name among U.S. pilots: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the significance went far beyond the numbers. This was not just a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of Japanese naval aviation. Japan could replace aircraft. It could not replace pilots. The Hellcat had done exactly what it was designed to do. It turned a war of skill into a war of attrition. And Japan was losing badly. Even worse, Japanese commanders misinterpreted what had happened. They believed the defeat was caused by bad luck, by poor weather, by unlucky timing. They did not fully grasp that the Hellcat, supported by radar and doctrine, had rendered their pre-war assumptions obsolete. By the end of the Marianas campaign, Japanese carrier air groups were shadows of their former selves. The Zero still flew, but it no longer ruled the sky. And with that shift, the fate of the Pacific War was sealed. Yet the Hellcat story was not finished, because as Japan grew desperate, it would turn to measures even more extreme. And the Hellcat would be there to meet them. 4 years, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had defined air combat in the Pacific. It was light. It was agile. And in 1941 and 1942, it had no equal in a turning fight. Japanese pilots believed maneuverability was everything, and for a time, they were right. The Zero's design philosophy was built around one idea: win the first turn, win the fight. To achieve that, engineers stripped away weight wherever possible. No armor behind the pilot. No bulletproof windscreen. No self-sealing fuel tanks. The result was an aircraft that could outturn anything in the sky, but only if it wasn't hit. Against early war American fighters, the Zero dominated. P-40s, Wildcats, Buffaloes, all struggled if they tried to dogfight. Japanese pilots laughed. Then the Hellcat arrived. The F-6F was not built to turn with the Zero. It was built to kill it. American engineers had studied combat reports carefully. They knew exactly how the Zero fought, and they designed the Hellcat to exploit every weakness. The F-6F was faster in level flight, faster in the dive, stronger in climate combat power. Most importantly, it could absorb punishment. A Hellcat could take hits that would instantly destroy a Zero. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing tanks prevented fires. Redundant systems kept the aircraft flying even when damaged. In combat, this changed everything. A Zero pilot might score hits, but the Hellcat stayed airborne. The Hellcat pilot only needed one good burst. 6.50 caliber machine guns firing together produced devastating firepower. Rounds punched through thin Zero wings and fuselage with ease. Fuel tanks ruptured. Engines caught fire. Control cables snapped. The Zero's greatest strength, lightness, became its fatal flaw. American pilots were trained accordingly. Never turn with a Zero. Attack from above. Dive through the formation. Fire. Extend away. If the Zero followed, it lost speed. If it didn't, it lost initiative. Either way, it was trapped. Japanese training doctrine made the situation worse. Pre-war pilots were elite, but they were irreplaceable. By 1943, Japan shortened training programs drastically. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal gunnery practice and almost no formation experience. They were thrown into the sky against Hellcat pilots who trained for hundreds of hours, and they died quickly. In one engagement after another, Hellcats returned to their carriers with bullet holes and victories. Zeros burned. Japanese radio intercepts told the story clearly. Pilots reported that American fighters were impossible to destroy, that they absorbed bullets and kept coming, that attacking them head-on was suicide. By late 1944, the kill ratio told the truth. The Hellcat achieved an overall 19-to-1 victory ratio against Japanese aircraft. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was even higher. The laughter was gone. The Zero had not suddenly become a bad aircraft. It had become an outdated one, fighting a war that no longer existed. And Japan had no answer, so they changed tactics. If they could not outfight the Hellcat, they would sacrifice themselves to destroy it. By late 1944, Japanese pilots understood something their commanders refused to admit. They could no longer win. Every engagement with Hellcats ended the same way. American fighters attacked from altitude. They dove through formations at high speed. They fired once. Then they were gone. Zeros tried to follow. They stalled. They burned energy. They became targets. Japanese loss rates became catastrophic. Carrier air groups that once fielded elite pilots were reduced to novices within weeks. The veterans were dead. The replacements were young, often barely trained. Some had fewer than 100 flight hours. Many had never fired their guns in combat before meeting the Hellcat. Yet the missions continued. Orders were orders. Attack the American fleet. Break through the fighter screen. Protect the bombers. It rarely worked. Hellcats intercepted Japanese strikes far from the carriers. Radar directed them with precision. Controllers guided fighters to exact intercept points, placing them above incoming formations. Japanese pilots often never saw the Hellcats before they were attacked. One moment the sky was clear. The next, tracers ripped through wings and cockpits. Survivors reported being hit from above and behind, again and again. They described Hellcats as falling from the sun. As losses mounted, Japanese commanders turned to the only tactic left, sacrifice. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, organized kamikaze attacks began. Young pilots were told their deaths would save Japan. They were trained not in dogfighting, but in how to hit a ship, how to aim, how to dive, how not to pull up. The Hellcat became the last barrier. Carrier air patrols flew constant orbits above the fleet. Hellcat pilots scanned the sky, 4 lone aircraft flying straight and fast. Those were the most dangerous. A kamikaze did not evade. It did not break away. It flew directly toward the target. Hellcat pilots learned to identify them instantly. No maneuvering, no defensive turns. Just a straight line of death. Interceptions became brutal. American pilots aimed for the engine or cockpit. There was no second chance. A kamikaze that survived even a few seconds too long could kill hundreds. The Hellcat's firepower and toughness proved decisive. It could approach head-on, absorb return fire, deliver a killing burst. Many Hellcat pilots later said these were the hardest kills psychologically. The enemy pilot never tried to escape. He flew calmly, purposefully, until he died. By 1945, the sky above the Pacific had changed completely. The Zero was no longer a hunter. It was prey. Japanese pilots no longer laughed. They flew knowing they would likely not return. And across the fleet, Hellcats kept flying. Day after day, mission after mission, holding the line between life and death. By the spring of 1945, the statistics were undeniable. American intelligence had compiled detailed reports from every carrier and airfield in the Pacific. The F-6F Hellcat had destroyed more Japanese aircraft in a single year than any other Allied fighter had in the entire war up to that point. The figures were staggering. Over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. Another 2,000 on the ground. A kill ratio of 19-1 in favor of the Hellcat. In contrast, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, once the mainstay of U.S. naval aviation, achieved only a 3-1 ratio. The Navy itself was shocked. Training manuals were updated. Tactics were rewritten. Every new pilot was told, fly above your opponent. Strike fast, trust the Hellcat. On the Japanese side, the impact was catastrophic. Carrier air groups that had once been elite were reduced to skeleton units. Veteran pilots were gone. New recruits flew missions with almost no experience. The Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiyu carrier air wings were nearly decimated. The fleet was losing air superiority faster than replacements could arrive. Even when Japan introduced the A6M50, a faster, slightly better armed variant, it was too late. The Hellcat's speed, armor, and firepower outmatched it at every turn. American pilots reported consistently, you could hit a Zero from any angle. You didn't have to be a hero, just in a Hellcat. Carrier deck logs tell the same story. A single cap flight of 6 to 8 Hellcats could intercept a formation of 20 to 30 enemy aircraft, scatter them, and still return with minimal losses. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was equally devastating. They knew the numbers, they knew the odds, some refused to take off at all. Aerial combat reports show repeated patterns. Engagements were over in less than 5 minutes. Japanese formations often disintegrated after the first burst of Hellcat fire. Pilots who survived reported panic and confusion, abandoning missions mid-flight. By By 1945, the U.S. Navy's operational commanders began using the Hellcat not just as a fighter, but as a force multiplier. It wasn't just about the aircraft, it was about presence. A squadron of Hellcats above a fleet meant no Japanese aircraft could approach safely. Any attempt to attack carriers ended in disaster. The math became obvious: 5,000 enemy aircraft lost in a year. 2,000 on the ground, minimal Hellcat losses. Every carrier, every fleet, every pilot knew the F-6F was now the backbone of U.S. naval aviation. Japanese pilots had laughed at the Hellcat in 1943. By 1945, they didn't laugh anymore. They feared it, they respected it. And in that fear, the Pacific skies had changed forever. October 1944, the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history, was about to unfold. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, had positioned over 450 aircraft from American carriers. Opposing him, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the Japanese Mobile Fleet, a force of almost 400 aircraft, many aboard carriers including the Shokaku, Zuikoku, and Taihu. Japanese intelligence underestimated the F-6F Hellcat. They expected the same performance as the older F-4F Wildcats. They believed they could overwhelm the American carriers with sheer numbers. They were wrong. The battle opened with dawn raids. Squadrons of Hellcats roared off the decks. Engines screaming, wings slicing the morning mist. American CAP, Combat Air Patrol, intercepted incoming Japanese formations dozens of miles from the fleet. From 10,000 feet, pilots dove into the tightly packed V formations of bombers and Zero fighters. In minutes, chaos. Planes erupted in fireballs, engines shredded, wings torn apart by .50 caliber fire. Pilots watched as their comrades fell. The Japanese called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The statistics were horrifying. Over 300 Japanese aircraft shot down in a single day. Carrier losses, 3. American losses, fewer than 30 aircraft. The Hellcat was unstoppable. Its robust armor absorbed hits that would destroy a Zero. Its firepower turned every encounter into a nightmare for Japanese crews. Lieutenant Commander John Smith of the USS Lexington recalled, "We didn't have to chase them. We climbed, we dove, we shot. They came at us in waves, and they broke apart like paper." The F-6F's range meant pilots could intercept the enemy long before they reached the fleet. The Wildcat's habit of dogfighting had died. Speed, altitude, and firepower became the new doctrine. By the battle's end, the Japanese air arm was decimated. Veteran pilots were gone. Carrier aviation was crippled. Japan could no longer challenge U.S. naval air superiority. The Pacific had changed permanently. Admirals wrote in their logs, "The F-6F Hellcat has turned the tide. Without it, we would not have maintained control of the Marianas." This was not just a tactical victory. It was strategic. The Philippines, the Marianas, the entire Central Pacific campaign, all paved by the dominance of one aircraft. The laughter of Japanese pilots in 1943 had long since faded. In its place, fear, respect, and a harsh acknowledgement of reality. By the time Okinawa fell, the F-6F Hellcat had cemented its legacy of the most effective carrier fighter in the Pacific War. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol, a machine that had rewritten the rules of naval combat. By mid-1945, the Pacific War was nearing its final chapters. The F-6F Hellcat had flown over 50,000 combat missions, destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, and changed the very nature of naval air warfare. Its pilots became legends. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, with 34 confirmed kills, recalled, "Every time I climbed into my Hellcat, I knew I had a machine that could survive what the enemy threw at me." That confidence allowed me to take risks I never could in other aircraft. Lieutenant Alexander Vrochu, famous for shooting down 6 Japanese dive bombers in under a minute, said, "The Hellcat was more than a fighter, it was a lifeboat. If you respected it, it would return you home." The Japanese, once laughing at the new American fighter, now feared it. The Zero, their legendary fighter, was no match for the Hellcat's speed, durability, and firepower. Dogfights that once relied on agility were now dominated by boom and zoom tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and carrier-based strikes. But the legacy of the Hellcat wasn't just numbers. It saved lives, secured islands, and enabled Allied forces to advance across the Pacific faster than ever. Entire campaigns, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, were made possible because pilots had the confidence to engage the enemy that their aircraft could outmatch any opponent. Even after the war, the Hellcat remained iconic. It served as a trainer and reserve aircraft for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, influencing the design of post-war fighters. Historians often note, the Hellcat didn't just fight the Japanese, it broke their spirit. From the decks of aircraft carriers to the jungles of Pacific Islands, the sound of its engines symbolized freedom, dominance, and survival. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that in war, technology alone doesn't win battles, but the right technology in the hands of skilled, determined men can change the course of history. The F-6F Hellcat was no longer just a fighter plane. It was a legend, a symbol of courage, innovation, and the relentless drive of the Allied forces in the Pacific. The F-6F Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a partner, a protector, a weapon, and for the men who flew it, it became part of their lives. Take Ensign Thomas Hudner, aboard the USS Lexington, on December 4, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Hudner's wingman, Lieutenant Jesse Brown, was hit and spiraling toward the ocean. Hudner didn't hesitate. He dove his Hellcat through anti-aircraft fire, crash-landed on the rough waters, and tried to save his friend. Though Brown ultimately died, Hudner's bravery earned him the Medal of Honor, and his story immortalized the bond between pilot and plane, courage and duty. Then there was Commander Butch O'Hare, flying a Hellcat over the Pacific skies near the USS Lexington. Enemy bombers swarmed, numbers overwhelming. O'Hare's Hellcat, though outnumbered, tore through the enemy formation with precision and speed. He destroyed 5 enemy bombers in a single mission, saving his carrier and countless lives. The Medal of Honor followed, but for O'Hare, it wasn't the medal, it was knowing the Hellcat could deliver him where it mattered most, every time. Even lesser-known pilots left stories etched in history. Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson, stationed in the Solomon Islands, flew consecutive sorties 4 hours, often facing enemy aircraft, to 2-1 in favor of the Japanese. His Hellcat took hits, smoke trailing from the engine, yet he returned to base each time. He later recounted, "You trust your Hellcat with your life. You push it, and it pushes back. It never let me down." And the younger pilots, barely 20, experiencing the terror of combat for the first time, the Hellcat was their lifeline. Its sturdy fuselage absorbed hits that would have destroyed a Zero. Its twin .50 caliber guns gave pilots confidence to strike first and strike hard. It was a fighter designed to win engagements, to survive, to let men live another day. Beyond the technical feats, it was the stories of human resilience and courage that defined the Hellcat era. Every mission, every dogfight, every perilous landing brought pilots closer to their own limits. And every time a Hellcat returned to the carrier deck, battered but unbroken, it carried a story of survival and heroism. These were not just pilots, they were men, facing impossible odds with a plane that gave them a fighting chance. From rookie ensigns to battle-hardened aces, the Hellcat was the constant. The silent witness to fear, bravery, and the resolve to survive. In their hands, the F-6F Hellcat, became more than steel and engine. It became a legend written in the skies of the Pacific. The Pacific War was a vast, fluid battlefield. Carrier decks became floating air bases, and control of the skies determined the fate of entire fleets. The introduction of the F-6F Hellcat in 1943 shifted the balance dramatically. Before the Hellcat, U.S. Navy pilots often struggled against the nimble Mitsubishi A6M0. Japanese tactics relied on speed, agility, and surprise, using hit-and-run attacks to overwhelm American fighters. Losses mounted. Carrier decks were vulnerable. Morale wavered. The Hellcat changed the rules. Its combination of speed, firepower, and ruggedness allowed pilots to fight on their terms. With a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 23,400 feet, 6.5 Outnumbered machine guns, and armor that could absorb damage from lighter enemy rounds, the F-6F transformed defensive carrier operations into offensive power projection. Tactics evolved quickly. Pilots learned to exploit the Hellcat's high-speed dive ease and superior roll rate. The traditional dogfight where turning circles and evasive maneuvers decided outcomes gave way to boom and zoom strategies. Pilots would dive from above, unleash a deadly burst, and climb back to altitude before the lighter Zeros could respond. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of carrier task forces, emphasized aggressive air tactics. He ordered Hellcats to control the airspace over enemy fleets, rather than merely escort bombers. This shift meant American pilots dictated where and when engagements occurred, a critical advantage in the sprawling Pacific theater. Training adapted as well. Pilots learned coordinated flight formations, energy management, and interception strategies. Squadron leaders drilled their men to anticipate enemy maneuvers, using altitude and speed to maintain the initiative. The Hellcat's performance meant pilots could execute offensive-defensive maneuvers, attack aggressively, while preserving the option to disengage safely. The results were staggering. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcat pilots decimated Japanese air power, shooting down over 300 aircraft in a single day. The combination of superior technology and refined tactics rendered the once feared Zero largely ineffective against coordinated American formations. Hellcat pilots weren't just surviving, they were rewriting naval air doctrine. Every sortie became a lesson, every dogfight a test of evolving tactics. Carrier air wings coordinated attacks, intercepting enemy strikes before they could threaten fleet formations. The Hellcat's influence extended beyond pure combat. Its reliability allowed pilots to fly longer missions, penetrate deeper into enemy territory, and return to carriers safely. Morale surged, confidence in U.S. naval aviation grew. Commanders could plan bold operations, knowing their fighters had the speed, firepower, and survivability to dominate enemy skies. By mid-1945, the Pacific War had been decisively altered. The Hellcat had turned attritional engagements into decisive victories, reshaping not only tactics, but the very strategy of naval warfare. What had started as an aircraft designed to meet a single threat, the Zero, had become the defining tool of American air supremacy in the Pacific. If you're amazed so far, hit like and comment your thoughts. Life on a World War II aircraft carrier was a study in extremes. Endless waves, cramped quarters, and the constant hum of machinery created an environment both claustrophobic and perilous. For a Hellcat pilot, the days were a delicate balance between preparation, duty, and survival. Pilots woke before dawn, often to the smell of salt, fuel, and engine oil. The flight deck was alive with activity, deck crews hustling, aircraft being fueled and armed, the roar of catapults and engines echoing across the deck. Every movement was choreographed with precision. One wrong step could cost a life. The Hellcat, though rugged, demanded respect. Pilots performed meticulous pre-flight checks, inspecting engines, control surfaces, and weapons. Failure in even a single component could be fatal when launching from a carrier's narrow deck. A missed rivet, a stuck throttle, or a jammed gun could mean death either in combat or during takeoff and landing. Takeoffs were high-stakes events. The carrier, a steel strip on a moving ocean, provided only a few hundred feet to accelerate a fully loaded F-6F to flight speed. Catapult-assisted launches were violent, throwing pilots into the air with a surge of acceleration that tested both aircraft and human endurance. For many, the first seconds were a blur of wind, vibration, and the roar of 6.50 caliber guns loaded and ready, though rarely fired in those moments. Landings were even more perilous. The arrestor wire stretched across the deck offered the only hope of stopping a 12,000-pound aircraft traveling over 100 miles per hour. A missed wire meant the aircraft could plunge into the ocean or collide with deck operations. Pilots spoke in hushed tones about wheels on deck or nothing, an unspoken mantra underscoring the lethal stakes. Between flights, pilots faced the monotony of waiting, the tension of intelligence briefings, and the ever-present threat of enemy action. Japanese air raids, kamikaze attacks, and submarine strikes were constant reminders that no carrier was truly safe. Yet, camaraderie thrived. Pilots relied on each other not just for strategy, but for mental survival. Letters from home, shared cigarettes, and stories of narrow escapes became lifelines. Combat missions varied from patrols to large-scale engagements over islands and enemy fleets. The Hellcat pilot's day might include hours circling above enemy territory, searching for elusive Zeros, before a sudden burst of action erupted in seconds: an ambush, a dogfight, or a fleet defense. The tempo was unpredictable, adrenaline spiking at moments and ebbing in the long waits between. Despite the dangers, pilots developed intimate knowledge of their aircraft. They learned to push the Hellcat to its limits, diving at full throttle, executing precise rolls, and using its armor and firepower to survive encounters that would have been fatal in earlier planes. Each sortie was a lesson in judgment, precision, and resilience. Medical support was limited but efficient. Injuries from ejection mishaps, crash landings, or enemy fire were treated aboard the carrier. Flight surgeons worked tirelessly to keep pilots in the air, knowing that each skilled Hellcat pilot represented a critical edge in controlling the skies. By the end of long campaigns, a pilot might be physically exhausted, emotionally drained, but hardened. Stories of bravery, narrow escapes, and miraculous victories circulated among squadrons. The Hellcat was more than metal and machine. It was a lifeline, a weapon, and a partner in the unforgiving war over the Pacific. Carrier operations demanded discipline, courage, and ingenuity. Pilots who mastered these elements, who understood the Hellcat and the perilous environment of the carrier, were the ones who survived to tell their stories and shape the course of the war. By late 1944, the Pacific War had shifted. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, and the nature of the threat was changing. One of the most feared developments was the kamikaze, the Japanese suicide plane, deliberately flown into Allied ships. Unlike conventional air attacks, these pilots were prepared to die to inflict maximum damage. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the USS Essex Task Force faced waves of kamikaze aircraft. Hellcats launched from the carriers into the skies over the Philippine Sea. Pilots knew that intercepting these aircraft was critical. One kamikaze slipping through could mean catastrophic damage to a ship, loss of lives, or even the destruction of an entire carrier. Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Howard, flying an F-6F-5 Hellcat, described the moment when a formation of 5 A6M0s, each loaded with explosives and determined to crash into American ships, appeared over the horizon. The Hellcat, equipped with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and reinforced armor, was designed for these moments. Howard pushed the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft respond with immediate acceleration. The sun glinted off the wings, creating a silhouette that made it easy to spot the kamikaze threat against the bright sky. Standard engagement doctrine for a Hellcat pilots was clear: attack early, disrupt the incoming planes, and prevent them from lining up for a clean strike on the fleet. Howard dove from 5,000 feet, guns blazing. Tracers lit the sky as rounds tore through the air. One kamikaze, hitting the port engine, veered off course, smoke trailing behind it as it spiraled into the sea. Another, despite taking heavy fire, managed to dive toward the USS Intrepid. Howard's wingman, Lieutenant Frank Carlson, intercepted, firing a burst that shredded the tail and wings of the plane, forcing it down just short of the carrier's deck. The Hellcat's speed, firepower, and durability were decisive. Even when facing multiple kamikaze attacks simultaneously, Hellcat squadrons were able to protect the fleet effectively. On that day alone, the squadron destroyed 18 incoming kamikaze aircraft before they could strike the carriers. The armored fuselage of the F-6F allowed pilots to sustain damage that would have crippled other fighters, giving them the ability to continue fighting despite gunfire, shrapnel, or near misses from exploding ordnance. By the end of the battle, the Hellcat had proven itself not just as an air superiority fighter against conventional enemy aircraft, but as a lifeline for the fleet. Its combination of speed, firepower, and rugged construction meant that American carriers could operate with greater confidence, and pilots like Howard and Carlson became legends for their roles in defending the Pacific Fleet. The Japanese, once dismissive of the Hellcat, now faced a machine that could not only dominate dogfights, but also intercept and destroy the most desperate of attacks. The kamikaze threat highlighted the evolution of the F-6F from a simple fighter into a carrier-based guardian, a symbol of both technological innovation and the relentless determination of American pilots. Each successful interception was not just a tactical victory, but a preservation of hundreds of lives aboard the carriers below, and a step closer to securing Allied control of the Pacific. Beyond the statistics and battle reports, the true legacy of the F-6F Hellcat was in the men who flew it. Stories from pilots in the Pacific theater illustrate not just the capabilities of the aircraft, but the courage, ingenuity, and determination that turned each mission into a fight for survival. In early 1944, Lieutenant Robert Copeland, assigned to VF-9 aboard the USS Essex, encountered a formation of 12 Mitsubishi A6M-Zeros while on patrol over the Marshall Islands. The Zeros dove at his squadron with aggressive intent, confident that their superior maneuverability would allow them to dominate. Copeland, flying an F-6F-3 Hellcat, knew that turning in a dogfight would play to the Japanese advantage. Instead, he used the Hellcat's superior acceleration and firepower. Diving from a higher altitude, he opened fire at 500 yards. Tracers arced through the sky, one Zero's engine igniting in a fireball midair. Another tried to evade, but the Hellcat's speed allowed him to close the distance and force it into a spin. In less than 3 minutes, Copeland had downed to enemy aircraft, and the remaining Zeros broke off. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, arguably the Navy's top Hellcat ace, was redefining the limits of what a single pilot could achieve. Flying missions over the Solomon Islands, McCampbell would often engage multiple enemy aircraft alone, relying on a mix of tactical aggression and intimate knowledge of his Hellcat's performance. On June 19, 1944, he downed 9 Japanese planes in one day, demonstrating the devastating impact a skilled pilot could have when fully exploiting the F-6F's strengths, speed, firepower, and ruggedness. These pilots also faced the challenge of operating over vast stretches of ocean, where mechanical failure or running out of fuel meant almost certain death. Stories abound of Hellcat pilots nursing damaged aircraft back to their carriers, their planes riddled with bullet holes, engines smoking, or controls partially disabled. Yet the aircraft's robust design allowed them to survive hits that would have grounded other fighters. The camaraderie among Hellcat pilots further strengthened their effectiveness. Pilots learned to cover each other's blind spots, share intelligence about enemy tactics, and coordinate attacks on larger formations of Japanese aircraft. This teamwork, combined with the Hellcat's performance, allowed American forces to dominate the skies over the Pacific. By late 1944, the Hellcat had proven itself in every type of aerial engagement, dogfights against Agile Zeros, intercepting bombers and torpedo planes, and defending the fleet against kamikaze attacks. Each victory contributed to the larger war effort, safeguarding troops on the ground, protecting naval vessels, and slowly pushing the Japanese forces back toward their home islands. The Hellcat was more than a fighter, it was a force multiplier, amplifying the skill and courage of every pilot who climbed into its cockpit. And in the stories of men, Copeland and McCampbell, we see the human side of aerial warfare: fear, determination, ingenuity, and the unyielding will to survive and succeed. As the war in the Pacific approached its final phases, American pilots faced a new and terrifying threat: the kamikaze. Japanese aircraft, loaded with explosives, would dive directly into ships, sacrificing themselves to inflict maximum damage. For many, it was a battle unlike any other they had faced. But the F-6F Hellcat proved to be a critical tool in countering this desperate tactic. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Carter, flying from the USS Franklin, encountered a squadron of Mitsubishi A-6M0s and Yokosuka D-4 wide-duty dive bombers, each armed to destroy. Some of these planes were on kamikaze missions. Carter and his wingman formed a combat air patrol above the fleet, scanning the horizon for any sign of the incoming threat. At 10:12 a.m. radar picked up 15 aircraft approaching at high speed from the northeast. The sailors on deck could already see the glint of sunlight off the wings. Carter dove from 10,000 feet, the Hellcat's engine roaring as he closed the distance. He fired a short burst at the lead duty, striking its fuselage and setting it ablaze. The plane spiraled away before it could reach the USS Franklin, exploding harmlessly in the water. Another two Hellcats joined Carter, intercepting multiple kamikaze aircraft simultaneously. The F-6F's combination of firepower and durability made these encounters survivable. Unlike lighter fighters, which risk structural failure when taking evasive action or sustaining hits, the Hellcat could endure damage and still remain controllable. Even pilots hit by return fire could often nurse their aircraft back to their carriers. Kamikaze attacks were particularly stressful because they left little room for error. A single plane hitting a battleship or aircraft carrier could cause massive destruction. Pilots had to rely on precise gunnery, rapid decision-making, and complete trust in their aircraft. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each capable of devastating damage, gave them the offensive capability to destroy incoming planes before they could reach their targets. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, now leading VF-15 aboard USS Essex, recounted one mission where a wave of 20 kamikazes approached their fleet. Every Hellcat in the air was firing continuously. It was chaos, smoke, and fire everywhere. But the Hellcat's speed allowed us to intercept, and its resilience kept us in the fight, he said. By the end of the engagement, 16 of the enemy aircraft were destroyed before reaching the ships. The psychological impact of the kamikaze threat was immense. Sailors and pilots knew that each aircraft approaching could be a suicide mission. But the Hellcat's presence provided a lifeline, giving crews a fighting chance. It wasn't just a machine. It was a guardian in the skies, capable of turning imminent disaster into survival. By the time the war reached Okinawa, in 1945, kamikaze attacks had intensified, but so had the effectiveness of the Hellcat pilots. Their training, experience, and trust in their aircraft allowed them to intercept hundreds of suicide planes, saving countless lives and vessels. The F-6F's legacy in these missions solidified its reputation as one of the most reliable and fearsome naval fighters of World War II. By mid-1945, the F-6F Hellcat had firmly established itself as a cornerstone of American naval air power. Across the vast expanses of the Pacific, the aircraft had not only met but exceeded expectations, reshaping the balance between Allied and Japanese forces. Over 12,000 Hellcats were produced between 1943 and 1945, serving aboard carriers, land bases, and in specialized night fighter squadrons. Its rugged design, ease of maintenance, and adaptability made it invaluable in every theater of naval aviation. Pilots like McCampbell, Carter, and countless others became aces flying the Hellcat, their success intertwined with the aircraft's capabilities. The Hellcat's dominance was most evident in statistics. It was credited with destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft in combat, more than any other Allied naval fighter. This staggering figure included dogfights against nimble Zeros, intercepting high-speed bombers, and defending fleets against kamikaze attacks. Its contribution went beyond sheer numbers. It changed the strategic calculations of both sides. Japanese pilots, once confident in their superior maneuverability, quickly learned that the Hellcat's speed, durability, and firepower left little room for error. But beyond raw numbers, the Hellcat left a legacy of morale and confidence. Sailors knew that when Hellcats patrolled the skies, they had a fighting chance. Pilots knew they were flying an aircraft capable of surviving extreme conditions, absorbing damage that would have downed lighter fighters. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American technological and tactical superiority. The design philosophy behind the Hellcat reflected lessons learned from earlier fighters. Its predecessor, the F-4F Wildcat, had proven sturdy, but often outclassed in dogfights. The F-6F retained the Wildcat's resilience, while adding speed, climb rates, and firepower to match or surpass Japanese aircraft. Engineers optimized the airframe for carrier operations, ensuring it could handle hard landings, turbulent seas, and the stress of extended combat missions. Pilots consistently praised the Hellcats for giving flight characteristics. Even in emergencies, engine failures, battle damage, or combat-induced stress, the aircraft allowed for a controlled recovery. Many stories, like those of McCampbell's numerous engagements or Carter's kamikaze interceptions, highlighted how the Hellcat's reliability directly contributed to mission success. By the end of World War II, the F-6F Hellcat had become more than a tool of war. It was a legend. It demonstrated that effective aircraft design, when combined with skilled pilots, could decisively shift the tide of battle. Its impact extended into post-war naval aviation, influencing the development of subsequent fighters and solidifying the importance of carrier-based air superiority. The Pacific sky, once dominated by Japanese confidence and skill, had been transformed. The F-6F Hellcat, flown by determined and trained pilots, had rewritten what was possible in aerial combat. It had taken the laughter of Japanese pilots, silenced it, and replaced it with respect and often fear for an aircraft that had become the backbone of American naval air power. As 1944 turned into 1945, the nature of the Pacific War shifted dramatically. Japanese forces, facing overwhelming losses in pilots, aircraft, and territory, increasingly relied on desperate measures, most notoriously the kamikaze attacks against Allied fleets. The Hellcat, already a proven fighter, was about to face one of its sternest challenges, intercepting determined pilots willing to die to sink ships. Kamikaze attacks were terrifying in their simplicity and relentlessness. Fast, low-flying aircraft would dive at maximum speed, aiming for aircraft carriers, battleships, and supply vessels. Conventional anti-aircraft fire often struggled to stop them before impact. This placed immense pressure on Hellcat pilots, who were tasked with intercepting these suicide missions before they could strike. The Hellcat's strength, speed, firepower, and ruggedness became crucial in these engagements. Pilots developed specialized tactics, head-on intercepts, coordinated squadron formations, and sustained firing runs to disable or destroy incoming planes. The aircraft's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of shredding wings and fuselages, proved essential in halting kamikaze attacks. One notable engagement occurred during the Okinawa campaign in spring 1945. A flight of Hellcats scrambled from the USS Essex as multiple kamikaze planes approached the fleet. Pilots dove into tight formations, unleashing concentrated fire. One Hellcat, flown by Lieutenant Commander William McMurray, engaged a Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, coming in at nearly 400 miles per hour. His first burst tore through the Frank's tail assembly, causing it to cartwheel into the sea before reaching the ships. Stories like McMurray's were repeated across the fleet. Hellcats intercepted hundreds of kamikazes, sacrificing their own structural integrity rather than relying on luck alone. The aircraft absorbed hits that would have downed lighter fighters, shattered windshields, pierced fuel tanks, and even partially destroyed wings. Time and again, Hellcats returned to their carriers, often barely flying, their pilots exhausted but alive. These engagements highlighted the Hellcats' unmatched combination of resilience and lethality. While pilots bore the burden of decision-making, the aircraft gave them a fighting chance, enabling daring maneuvers and last-second recoveries that saved countless lives and ships. The lessons learned in these deadly encounters would influence naval aviation tactics for decades. By the war's end, kamikaze attacks had cost the Japanese dearly, but failed to stem the tide of Allied naval power. Hellcats had not only survived the final months of the Pacific conflict, they had dominated it. The aircraft's reputation among Japanese pilots had shifted from ridicule to fear. Those who once laughed at the Hellcat now counted it among the most dangerous adversaries in the sky. With Japan's surrender in August 1945, the F-6F Hellcat's combat career officially ended, but its legacy was just beginning. Over the course of the war, Hellcats had flown more than 50,000 sorties in the Pacific, destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft, and earned a killed-to-lost ratio unmatched by any other Allied fighter. Its impact extended far beyond statistics. It reshaped naval aviation and set a new standard for carrier-based aircraft. The Hellcat's design philosophy influenced post-war fighters. Engineers studied its rugged airframe, forgiving handling characteristics, and powerful armament layout. Lessons from the Hellcat's ability to absorb damage and remain controllable informed the development of early jet fighters like the F-9F Panther and F-2H Banshee. Aircraft carriers themselves adapted, designing decks and support systems to handle larger, heavier, and more durable fighters in combat. Veterans carried the Hellcat's reputation into civilian life. Pilots recounted stories of aerial duels, harrowing dives, and miraculous recovery stories that became part of naval lore. Some joined the newly formed U.S. Air Force or remained in the Navy, passing on tactics, combat experience, and the hard-earned knowledge of how a well-designed fighter could turn the tide of battle. The aircraft also made a mark in culture. It appeared in post-war films, books, and documentaries, often depicted as a symbol of American ingenuity and resilience. But for the men who flew it, the Hellcat was more than a symbol. It was a trusted partner, a lifeline in hostile skies, and a machine that turned impossible odds into victories. Globally, other air forces took note. The Hellcat's emphasis on simplicity, durability, and firepower influenced British and Australian naval aviation programs, while Japan, in defeat, studied the aircraft to understand why their pilots had been outmatched. The F-6F's lessons echoed into the Korean War, where similar carrier-based jet tactics borrowed from Hellcat-era strategies. By the time the last Hellcats were retired from U.S. service in the early 1950s, the aircraft had cemented its place in history. Its service record adaptability, and combat performance made it a benchmark for future generations. Pilots who had once laughed at or feared it could not deny one truth: the Hellcat had dominated the Pacific sky, earned the respect of friend and foe alike, and ensured that naval air power remained decisive in modern warfare. The story of the F-6F Hellcat was not just about machines or battles, it was about courage, innovation, and the men who refused to be outdone. From the first flight to the final sortie, the Hellcat proved that in the right hands, technology and determination could achieve what once seemed impossible. While the F-6F Hellcat's technical achievements were extraordinary, it was the men who flew them that truly brought the aircraft to life. Pilots trained relentlessly, enduring grueling schedules on aircraft carriers where sleep was scarce, decks were short, and the margin for error was almost non-existent. Every launch and recovery demanded precision, courage, and nerves of steel. Veterans like Commander David McCampbell, the top Navy ace of World War II, became legends not just for their kill counts, but for their leadership and tactical ingenuity. McCampbell's careful study of Japanese flight patterns, combined with his aggressive tactics, allowed him to down 34 enemy planes, most of them in the Hellcat. Stories like his inspired entire squadrons to fly with the confidence that the Hellcat gave them, that even against numerically superior forces, skill and determination could prevail. The Hellcat's forgiving flight characteristics allowed rookie pilots to survive where other aircraft might have doomed them. Carrier operations were treacherous. One misstep during takeoff or landing could spell disaster. The robust landing gear and excellent low-speed handling meant that even inexperienced pilots had a fighting chance. Many credited the Hellcat with saving their lives during early sorties, when nerves were raw and the Pacific skies were unforgiving. Beyond aces, countless unnamed pilots performed vital roles, flying patrols, escorting bombers, and intercepting enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Each mission carried immense risk. Some returned home with medals and accolades, while others never made it back. Their sacrifices underline the harsh reality of war. For every celebrated victory, there were unrecorded acts of bravery, moments of quick thinking, and split-second decisions that ensured survival. Squadrons became tight-knit families. Pilots learned each other's strengths, weaknesses, and quirks. They relied on teamwork in dogfights, coordinated attacks, and sometimes sheer luck. Hellcats flew side by side, covering each other, with the roar of their engines and the glint of wingtip in the sun signaling not just combat readiness, but solidarity. Even after the war, these pilots carried memories that shaped their lives. Reunions, memoirs, and oral histories preserve the lessons and experiences, ensuring that future generations would understand both the human and mechanical elements that made the F-6F Hellcat dominant. These stories reminded the world that machines alone do not win wars, people do. The legacy of the Hellcat pilots extended beyond their combat records. They influenced training programs, aircraft design considerations, and the ethos of carrier aviation for decades. Their courage, adaptability, and ingenuity set a standard for naval aviators that resonates even today. The F-6F Hellcat didn't just end the dominance of the Japanese Zero, it reshaped naval aviation forever. Its success demonstrated that rugged, reliable, and versatile aircraft could outperform technically superior opponents if paired with the right tactics and trained pilots. This lesson became a cornerstone for a future fighter development. Designers took note of the Hellcat's balance between speed, firepower, and survivability. Its robust construction, capable of withstanding extensive damage and still returning pilots safely to their carriers, influenced post-war naval aircraft design. Planes like the F-8F Bearcat and later jets carried forward this principle. Survivability could be as crucial as raw performance. The Hellcat also reinforced the importance of pilot-centered design. Cockpit visibility, ease of handling, and forgiving flight characteristics all contributed to combat effectiveness. Lessons learned from its operational history inform training programs, emphasizing the integration of technology with human skill. Flight instructors studied Hellcat sorties, noting how pilots leveraged its strengths while minimizing vulnerabilities, a template for teaching aerial combat for decades. In the broader context, the Hellcat's impact extended to carrier warfare doctrine. The aircraft proved that massed formations of well-trained pilots in dependable machines could establish air superiority, defend fleets, and support amphibious operations. Carrier task forces became central to U.S. naval strategy, a shift underscored by the Hellcat's performance in battles from the Marianas to Leyte Gulf. Veterans carried these lessons into civilian aviation as well. Many became test pilots, instructors, or engineers, applying combat-tested knowledge to peacetime aeronautics. The emphasis on reliability, redundancy, and human factors in cockpit design owes much to the experiences of those who flew Hellcats through fire and storm in the Pacific. Perhaps most importantly, the Hellcat inspired a generation of Americans. Newsreels, magazine articles, and later documentaries celebrated its victories and the bravery of its pilots. Children and teenagers aspiring to fly saw in the Hellcat a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and the triumph of skill and preparation over fear and uncertainty. By the end of the war, the Hellcat had achieved over 5,000 aerial victories, more than any other Allied naval aircraft. Yet, beyond numbers, its true legacy lies in the way it proved that effective aircraft design and exceptional pilot skill, combined, could tip the scales even in the most desperate and chaotic battles. Long after the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared from Pacific battlefields, the men who flew the Hellcat remained symbols of courage and resilience. They weren't just pilots, they were innovators, risk-takers, and pioneers who tested the limits of both man and machine. Many of these veterans returned home quietly. Unlike some who sought the spotlight, Hellcat pilots often preferred to let their deeds speak for themselves. Yet their stories persisted, shared in letters, reunions, and memoirs. They recounted hair-raising dogfights, near misses with flak and mechanical failure, and moments of sheer terror turned triumph. Each tale was a testament to human adaptability and the relentless pursuit of survival under impossible odds. Naval aviators spoke of the unique bond formed in the cockpit of a Hellcat. The aircraft demanded respect, it demanded mastery. Pilots had to know its quirks, understand its limits, and trust its robust design. In return, the Hellcat delivered performance that could turn the tide of an engagement and bring its pilot home alive. Commemorative events, memorials, and museums have since preserved the legacy of these men and their aircraft. Restored F-6Fs sit in hangars, silent but imposing, whispering the stories of missions flown, bombs dropped, and skies dominated. Visitors can almost hear the roar of the Pratt and Whitney engine, see tracers lighting the sky, and feel the tension of aerial combat. The human element, the courage, the decisions made in split seconds, the daring maneuvers executed under fire remains the most compelling part of the Hellcat legacy. Training programs today still emphasize lessons from these pilots: teamwork, situational awareness, and exploiting an aircraft's strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. These principles, born in the crucible of war, continue to guide modern aviators. Above all, remembering the Hellcat heroes is about honoring the mindset they embodied: relentless determination, calm under pressure, and a refusal to surrender, no matter the odds. Their stories remind us that in aviation, as in life, skill and courage often outweigh numbers and machinery. By late 1944 and into 1945, the tide of the Pacific War had turned firmly in favor of the Allies. Japanese air power, once dominant, was dwindling under relentless Allied strikes on carriers, airfields, and supply lines. But even in the waning days of the conflict, the skies were not without danger. Hellcat pilots found themselves facing increasingly desperate and cunning opponents. Kamikaze attacks became more frequent, adding a new and terrifying dimension to aerial combat. Pilots could no longer rely solely on conventional dogfighting tactics. They had to anticipate suicidal dives from aircraft loaded with explosives, intent on hitting ships at any cost. Every mission required heightened vigilance and split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Despite these challenges, the F-6F Hellcat continued to dominate. Its rugged construction, powerful engine, and superior climb rate allowed pilots to intercept incoming formations and dive to safety if necessary. Veteran aces, some with dozens of kills, adapted their combat strategies to the changing nature of the war. They emphasized altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and aggressive, but calculated maneuvers. One notable engagement occurred during the Battle of Okinawa. A Hellcat squadron scrambled from a carrier to intercept a Japanese strike force approaching the fleet. The pilots executed textbook tactics, climbing to intercept, breaking enemy formations with precise bursts of fire, and then using speed and agility to evade counterattacks. Within minutes, multiple enemy planes were destroyed or driven off, while the Hellcats returned to their carriers with minimal losses. These final dogfights were a testament to the training, discipline, and bravery of the pilots, as well as the effectiveness of the Hellcat itself. By war's end, the F-6F was credited with more aerial kills than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific, a staggering 5,223 confirmed victories. Its success was not merely technical. It was the combined product of human skill, mechanical reliability, and relentless determination. The war was drawing to a close, but for the Hellcat pilots, the lessons of combat endured. Every mission, from intercepting bombers to engaging desperate kamikaze attacks, reinforced the principles of vigilance, courage, and adaptability that define their service. They had not only dominated the skies, they had secured the seas, the islands, and ultimately the outcome of the Pacific War. At 7:15 a.m., a required morning over the Pacific, the USS Hellcat Squadron's operations log with the aftermath of the latest engagements. Pilots leaned against their aircraft, wiping sweat from their foreheads, eyes still reflecting the dawn light over the endless ocean. The air was calm, almost serene, but everyone knew the storms they had just faced. The F-6F Hellcat, initially laughed at by Japanese pilots, had proven its deadly efficiency once again. Its rugged frame, powerful engine, and superior climb rate had dominated the skies, leaving a trail of bewildered and defeated enemy aircraft behind. Commander James "Jimmy" Harper, the squadron leader, walked along the line of parked Hellcats. His face bore the exhaustion of continuous missions, yet there was pride in his eyes. "Gentlemen," he began, addressing the pilots, "today we've proven what our aircraft can do in the hands of skilled pilots. The Japanese may have underestimated the Hellcat, but that mistake cost them dearly." The pilots nodded, some quietly reflecting, others still catching their breath. Intelligence reports later confirmed the scale of the impact. Enemy losses were staggering. Dozens of Zero fighters downed, bombers turned back, critical supply lines disrupted. The F-6F Hellcat's climb to dominance in the Pacific was no accident. It combined raw power, tactical innovation, and the skill of determined men who refused to yield. In the hangars, mechanics checked every detail of the Hellcats: engines, control surfaces, weapon systems, all scrutinized after the brutal encounters. The aircraft had taken hits, sustained damage, yet they were ready again. The metal beasts bore the scars of battle, much like their pilots, but both were resilient. Both had proven themselves essential to the Allied push across the Pacific. Stories of individual heroism continued to circulate among the crews. Lieutenants who had faced overwhelming odds, pilots who had outmaneuvered entire squadrons, gunners who had defended their ships with unwavering courage all became part of the growing legend of the Hellcat. And yet, every success was measured against the stark reality of war. For each victory, lives were risked, aircraft destroyed, and the ocean claimed its toll. By the afternoon, the squadron gathered on the flight deck to debrief. Maps, mission reports, and enemy sighting charts were spread across tables. Harper pointed to strategic zones where the Hellcats had decisively shifted the balance. "The sky is ours to contest," he said. "But never forget our greatest weapon is the pilot's skill. The aircraft is only as good as the hands that fly it." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Pacific glimmered like molten gold. The Hellcats rested, engines cooled, wings reflecting the dying light. Pilots, mechanics, and commanders alike understood that today's victories were part of a larger struggle, one that demanded constant courage and unyielding determination. The F-6F Hellcat, once underestimated and mocked, had become a symbol of aerial supremacy. Its story was not just of metal and machinery, but of men who refused to be outmatched. The Japanese pilots who had laughed at the Hellcat learned, often too late, that they were facing a fighter designed to dominate and men who would fight with everything they had. December 1943 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific theater. The Hellcat's rise was unstoppable. Its legend, forged in fire and steel, would carry the name into the annals of history. And for those who flew it, each mission was a testament to the fact that courage, skill, and determination could turn the tide of war even in the face of impossible odds. If you've followed the journey of the F-6F Hellcat, witnessed its rise from underestimated fighter to Pacific dominator, remember this: every aircraft, every mission, every pilot has a story. A story of resilience, of strategy, and of the human spirit refusing to yield. Hit that like button if the courage of these men inspires you. Subscribe to honor forgotten heroes and preserve these stories for generations. Comment below with your thoughts. How would you have flown the Hellcat if you were in their cockpit? This is the story of the F-6F Hellcat, the Pacific skies, and the pilots who turned laughter into fear, proving that in war, skill and courage always dominate the skies. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.